In the mid-1960s, Alfa Romeo was producing probably the best enthusiast-led saloon and sports cars in the world. The likes of the 105 series Giulia and Spider were quite simple mechanically, but they were tuned in such an extraordinary package with such brilliant styling that today they are among the greatest ever classic cars. Now, as the 1960s progressed into the 70s and then the 70s progressed into the 80s, their star had really started to fall away. Alfa's reputation for producing enthusiast-led cars was being watered down. Their reputation for building pretty cars had virtually vanished altogether, and with an increasingly iffy reputation, their profits really were not holding up. And in 1986, Alfa Romeo was sold to Fiat. Now, in the 38 years between 1986 and today, Alfa Romeo's story has been one of mixed fortune, shall we say. But in the immediate aftermath of the Fiat takeover, the sudden influx of money and talent into Alfa Romeo opened up a new era. This 1990s and into the early 2000s revival of one of the greatest badges ever to adorn the front of a motor car. And right at the centre of that era is what we have this month at Manor Park Classics, this 916 series Alfa Romeo GTV. So today we're going to have a little look at the history of this car, figure out how and why it exists in the form it does, then discuss the form we see in front of us, and of course we'll go for a little drive as well later on. But first I want to take us back to 1986 when Fiat bought Alfa Romeo, because at that point they were in the middle of developing their new big saloon car, the Alfa 164, that was launched I think in 1987 or so, and over the course of its life received quite mixed reviews. That was kind of ground zero for the new Alfa Romeo, a challenger in the executive car segment, but one that wasn't quite so successful as either Fiat or Alfa Romeo were hoping. Now, of course, the 164 was based on a Fiat platform. It was the same car, for example, as the Lancia Thema and even the Saab 9000 as well. But as the years rolled on, some serious mojo came back to Alfa Romeo, and in 1992 they launched the smaller 155. That was almost immediately followed up, however, by this car, the Spider and GTV, launched in 1993. And I just want to get that into your heads for a second. 1993, this car is a 31-year-old design. We will get into that a little bit when we talk about the design, about the style, about the bodywork, etc. But this car just does not strike anyone as a car quite so old, because it is so magnificently pretty and magnificently timeless. But in that era, Alfa Romeo were treading water. With the 155, 164, and of course then this car, as well as the later 145, etc., Alfa Romeo had an all-new and for once quite coherent range of cars. They also gained some sorely needed all-new and Fiat-derived engines and created this quite new, quite novel image for Alfa Romeo as a premium-facing car brand that was not absolutely the last word in driver focus, as maybe they were some decades before, but instead were absolutely at the pinnacle of style. So the car that preceded this GTV, and more importantly the Spider, the convertible version of this, was the 105 Spider we discussed only a moment ago, from back in the mid-1960s. This is how kind of throttled Alfa Romeo had become, that they were still producing a car launched in 1966 and built on a platform from 1954 in the early 1990s. The original Spider lasted until 1993, by which point it was having to kind of somewhat compete against the likes of the Mazda MX-5. Now, the 105 series Spider was a brilliant car, and in many ways it could stand up to that 1990s competition, but it was never a huge seller, especially in those last few years, because it was expensive and it was elderly. And so a total rethink from the ground up was necessary when coming up with this new generation of sports-facing Alfa Romeos. Now, the headline, of course, is the switch from rear-wheel drive to front-wheel drive. And a lot of people complain about front-wheel drive cars, but of course, if there's anyone who's going to do front-wheel drive cars well, it's the Fiat Group and Alfa Romeo. Fiat were responsible, really, for the mass-market European switch to front-wheel drive in the late 60s and early 70s, and a part of that, as an independent company at the time, was the Alfa Sud. Alfa Romeo's little kind of big super mini small family car thing launched in 1971 that was just a riot to drive. That car may have been front wheel drive. It was Alfa's first modern front drive car, but it was sublime in the way it drove. And so in creating this new car, in having the platform upon which this sits being a front drive one, was neither a surprise nor necessarily a hindrance. Now, of course, beside the old Spider was the old GTV, which came from the big Alfetta saloon car and was watered down into this new kind of coupe sports car. Initially the Alfetta GT, then the Alfetta GTV with a larger engine, and of course the GTV6 with the famous Busso engine up front. Those old cars had a transaxle at the back and were again rear-wheel drive, but they died off at the end of the 1980s because, again, they were very, very elderly by that point. They just could not stand up to the competition. So in kind of combining the GTV and the Spider lines into one car, Alfa Romeo could fill two slightly different market segments, giving us both a coupe in this form and a convertible for those who wanted it. Now, a common misconception with Alfa Romeos of this age is that they are Fiats in drag, and I'm afraid to say, in fact, I'm very pleased to say, that that's not true. Because Alfa Romeo, while having a big pot of money from which to work from, and all the platforms and Fiat's engine development to work off, they had a lot of independence. They could really choose their own path and choose these platforms to feel like proper Alfa Romeos. So at the front we have McPherson struts. That's pretty standard for front suspension even today. In fact, manufacturers are still moving to McPherson struts today because they are compact, they are affordable, and of course they can be tuned to drive so well. Very delicate front ends can be made possible with McPherson struts. But at the back, this car has a multi-link rear suspension. Nabbed from the Alfa 155 launched the year before, and this car is very similar to a 155 beneath. But for a front-wheel drive car in this period, to have a multi-link rear end was really quite unusual. And so that placed these kind of things apart in that period when looking for a kind of sports-facing coupe. And when you were looking for a sports-facing coupe, or convertible of course, you weren't exactly spoilt for choice. I mentioned in 1989 the Mazda MX-5 was launched, and so the very end of the original Spider did compete against it, but the MX-5 set off a bit of a renaissance in sports cars and sports coupes. You of course have a few choices from Japan, the S-chassis Nissans, etc., but in Europe we start to see the Fiat Barchetta from the same parentage as the Alfas. We see the likes of the MGF as well. And in terms of coupes, only the year before this, we saw like the Rover 220 Turbo Coupe. We have the Vauxhall Calibra, the Ford Probe, etc. So this early 90s era saw a bit of a renaissance, not just in Alfa Romeo, but also in the sports coupe and the sports convertible market. And so Alfa Romeo had their work cut out in creating something to compete with this all-new competition. But compared to all those cars that have now aged quite a lot, this thing just hasn't at all. So first with the engines, and this car is a 2-litre twin spark. The centre of the range sat above the basic 1.8 twin spark, and this is a kind of rebuilt version of Fiat's Pratola Serra engine, which was launched in the mid-1990s to some serious acclaim. But Alfa Romeo totally redeveloped it to make it feel like an Alfa Romeo power unit, to give it some sonority, and also of course giving it a twin spark cylinder head, bringing back that technology that Alfa Romeo was so well known for in the decades gone by. But of course also the top of the range version of this car used Alfa's famous Busso V6. Now of course engineered for front wheel drive for a transverse setup, which made One of these with potentially 250 brake horsepower from 3.2 litres made it a bit of a monster with the front wheel drive system. But the sheer aural beauty of that Busso V6 just added to the style that I feel we've been dancing around so much already, because this is a Pininfarina designed car. And Pininfarina are well known for their brilliant Ferraris, let's say, I think most famously from the 1960s and 1970s. Indeed, they did the old Alfa Romeo Spider, that brilliant boat tail car that you just feel like Dustin Hoffman driving along. But this thing in 1993 was so radically different, was so individual, was so unlike what every other manufacturer was doing, that not only has it become timeless, but it is so unmistakably Alfa Romeo. In fact, looking at it here, it's a concept car with those beady little headlamps, the tiny Alfa Romeo grille feeding into the bonnet, and of course that big, very deep swage line at a seriously raked angle up towards the rear of the car. And of course the light bar going across the back, and the fact that the wheelbase compared to the body of the car is quite long. It gives it a very, very squat stance. It makes it look purposeful. And in fact, this car looks a lot smaller than it actually is. It just has so much purpose to it. I just adore it. And inside too, we have this bright plastic trim across the dashboard, those deep instrument binnacles, and of course the 3 vents in the middle. It's just, there is something about these cars that is unmatched by any other manufacturer stylistically. Anyway, let's go for a drive, shall we? Now, I wanted to start this one right as we get into the car, because compared to all the other 90s coupes, this thing is just a level above. These leather seats are of the absolute highest quality. They've got the Alfa Romeo crest stitched into them. And as I mentioned, that dashboard design is just so much nicer than anything out of any other manufacturer. And people love to go on today, and fair enough, rightly so, about Nissan Silvias, or in the UK, you know, a 180SX, 200SX, 240SX, depending on where you are in the world. But they just feel like very normal cars compared to this. Everything about this car just has a sense of character and a sense of design magic that they just don't. So much extra care has been put into making this car feel premium, into making you as the driver feel special and feel important. And that, I'm going to say as well, extends, put the handbrake on, into the engine. Because thrumming into life is that 4-cylinder 16-valve twin-spark engine. And again, compared to every other manufacturer producing a small kind of affordable coupe at this point, I'd even say in this price point, BMW 316, BMW 318, you know, Mercedes C-Class coupes a little bit later on as well, none of them got anywhere near the level of brilliant thrumminess, the character of the engine in this car. It just has that total magic to it. So this engine produces about 150 brake horsepower. Might be up to 155 for this later car. Let me just close the window as well. And it was so well reviewed in period. It was so well loved for its fizziness, for its kind of adventurous feeling to it. Because, you know, put a normal 2-litre engine into a coupe of this kind of era, and it can very easily just fall flat on its face and feel normal. But this has an absolutely fantastic soundtrack to it. It's only a little 4-cylinder engine, and a lot of people would very happily say, oh, it's not the V6. I want a GT V6 really, or a Spider V6, whatever floats your boat. But this, it's such a happy engine. It's such a high revving engine. And it reminds me in many ways of the Rover K-Series engine. Now this engine is a little bit beefier than the K-Series engine. I think it's got better torque characteristics than a 1.8K series engine, at least from what I'm feeling it here, but it has that fizziness, it has that eagerness, that willingness to just rev its nuts off while being totally tractable down low as well. Totally sonorous little engine. So away from the engine a little bit, and the first thing I noticed when I sat in this car, barring kind of the quality of the design, which is fantastic, is how high you sit and how easy it is to see out. So sitting high isn't fantastic for a sports car, but you kind of look down over the bonnet. And as the car rakes up behind you, it means that you don't actually feel too tall in this thing. It's a little bit weird in that way, because you'd expect it to. But the whole car feels like it's got a kind of drag car stance to it, which feels naturally very, very evocative. Oh, that twin spark engine is ace. So good. What's also really nice are the controls, the way everything's laid out in here. So the gear lever is quite a long throw, and at first glance you think that's wrong, but actually it's got such a positive change. It feels like you're doing something mechanical. You may have already noticed that I'm changing gears for no reason in this car. I'm changing gear because it's fun. And reportedly, when this car was in development, or it might have been the later 156 actually, I'm not 100% sure, but one of the Alfas from this era, when they were developing it, Fiat had a drive of the car, of course. And they looked at it and said, why have you chosen to give it such a long throw gear change? And then Alfa Romeo went into their museum and handed Fiat an old 105 series Giulia. I think it was a coupe, it might have even been a GTV, who knows? But they handed them that car, showed them the positivity in the long throw gear change and how fun that makes it feel in spite of at first glance appearing wrong. And then Fiat understood, Fiat agreed, and gave them the green light on a gear change like that. And there's a sense of heft to all the controls in this car as well. You've got to put a little bit of force into things. It's not all super, super light, but of course, it's not heavy either. It means that it's fun while still being super easy to hustle about the place. So, so easy to drive. It doesn't feel like a sports car in that regard. And I would use that as a negative regard if it was, because you want it to be nice and eager. You want it to be taut, but you don't want it to be a pain to drive. And this, absolute perfection. So the handling and the power steering on this car is superbly weighted, and it's also fantastically geared as well. I don't know how many turns lock to lock it is, but not many is my guess, judging by the steering inputs I'm putting in, and that makes it feel very immediate. That makes it feel very, very tuned into what you're doing, because you don't want to be arm twirling. If you're arm twirling all over the place, then you lose all sense of flow of the road. And in this car, that is so close to the surface. I just love the feeling in the steering of this. And the suspension as well. I mentioned McPherson struts. I think I mentioned it anyway, that McPherson struts can give you a very delicate feeling front end, and in this car they absolutely do, though a lot of that of course is from the steering. It just feels so nimble, and again, it feels like it's quite a short car. It feels small, but it's not really. And when you look around you, I mentioned the driving position before, there's loads of visibility in here as well. It's so unusual for a, premium, but really quite mainstream as well, coupe. Never mind one that's over 30 years old now, to feel so capable and so well-rounded and just so beautifully engineered. I always love Alfa Romeos, but this one just feels special. It really, really does. I'm not kidding you there. This just feels ace. I love it to bits. So if you are interested in this thing yourself, then please do follow the link in the description. Have a look at the website at this car, and even come and have a look for yourself as well, because it's just a joyous little piece of Italian motor history. Italian motoring history actually that I would absolutely drive every day because this just feels nice. What a lovely little car.